Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. A couple of preliminary words. I do root for BYU, except when they play against Utah. Um, but I will also suggest, I understand the reasons why BYU probably left the Mountain West Conference, but there are two spots available in the Big 12 Conference that has 10 teams, right? Go figure. One of those ought to be Colorado State. Another one ought to be BYU. So tell it to the president from me. Get BYU in the Big 12. I'm sure they'll take you with welcome arms. So I have two presentations today. I will go until I think 4 o'clock is what somebody said. I have a lot of material to go over. The first part is going over some of the major trends nationally in the state, and then focusing on the Provo metropolitan area, which includes Utah and Wasatch counties combined. I'll highlight some major trends as I see them. Then I'll talk about redevelopment opportunities here that you already see going on. Actually, driving in this morning, I was very impressed with the amount of redevelopment I'm already seeing. And I think it's because of your small land base that you're more attuned to redevelopment than maybe comparable size metropolitan areas are. Then we'll switch slides. So have some Q&A. We'll switch slides, and I'll talk about the role of value capture in facilitating redevelopment. And that is a 2-hour presentation. I will bring it down to half an hour or so. You have the slideshow. It is yours to keep. It's available. It's already on your system. And it's based on a book that I wrote, came out with last year, Foundations of Real Estate Development Financing, a guide for public-private partnerships. This is for the city of Provo. Read it, test afterwards, and the test is redeveloping the city. So let's see, I've got to acquaint myself with the machinery here. This is World War III button. Okay, that's who I am, and that's who I was, the University of Utah. Loved being here. I want to follow up on Robert Grove's comment earlier. Actually, this is a perfect follow-on. A lot of things Robert talked about, I'm going to feed right back into in terms of trends and changes and so on and so forth. You got to clean your air up. And you all know that. We all know that. I am a casualty. We came in 2008 believing that we were going to be spending the rest of our lives in the Wasatch Front. In 2014, I was crawling on my hands and knees, gasping for air during certain times of the year, and not just the winter inversions, the high summer ozones. I stopped my medium-distance, long-distance running. I was captive to the elliptic machines inside the Salt Lake County gyms, looking outdoors, looking through the windows at the landscape I couldn't even be in for long periods of time. We had to leave. Fix the air, fix your health, and have a wonderful life afterwards. So let's go on. Much of my presentation in the first half is based on a book that came out in 2012 or thereabouts, Reshaping Metropolitan America. I have a database there online. I am updating the database now, but that old database is available for you to draw down, and you can look at every metropolitan area in the country, every state in the country, and look at long-term trends to the year 2030. Now, my presentation today goes to 2040. I have a new model about finished that's going to go to 2050. And I'll mention the new model occasionally as I go through this to sort of highlight some of the major trends. You know, we've all gone through this period of the housing bubble, the housing crash. Things are a lot different now, and I'll talk about some of those differences a little later on, but the bottom line is the subprime market is history. We should never have had it, of course, but it's gone. 20% down payments are becoming more and more common, and that's going to drive down home ownership rates. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Meaning we'll probably see smaller homes, maybe not much smaller, but somewhat smaller homes, probably more people per home, more renters, and so on, and we're already seeing some of that take place here. So let's look at the big numbers. I divide up the world into the U.S. between 2010 and 2040, Utah, Provo, Orem metropolitan area, which includes Wasatch County, and the Salt Lake metropolitan area, which includes Davis County and Tooele County. No surprise, you are a growing dynamo here. The question is, how are you going to grow? The question is not if you're going to grow, you're going to grow. The question would be how you're going to grow. Robert talked about that extensively earlier this morning. You'll be, by my numbers, you'll be about 1.1 million people in the metropolitan area by the year 2040. So, you have all these numbers from the governor's office to RCLCO to my numbers. They're all saying the same thing, a lot of growth ahead of you. Now, I'll go around the country frequently, and I talk about two other factors around growth. One is the aging population, and one is the changing complexion of the population. So in terms of the aging population, 42% of the share of the net change in population in the U.S. will be people turning 65. Now, they're not being added to the population. I have to be very clear about that. They're already here. But as a relationship, they are, as a number, going to be 42% of the net change in population for the U.S. That's really no news. Maybe the number is news, but the trend is no news. In Utah, it's a much younger state. We all know that. It's a growing state. It's importing people. As you import people, the population is younger, although I saw in the paper this morning, the Salt Lake Tribune, that the median age of the state is actually rising gradually. But nonetheless, Utah is aging at maybe half the pace of the U.S. as a whole. Salt Lake County metropolitan area is a little higher, actually a lot higher than the state, but Utah County, Wasatch County, of course, is very small. This is here because you have a combination of a young population base that's adding children at a very high pace, and you're bringing people in. That combination means that your share of the elderly population to growth will be very small, except that look at this number here. You're going to be going from 35,000 people over 65 in 2010 to nearly 100,000 people over 65 in 2040. So the percent rate of growth is very large, and you may need to pay attention to that, especially in your social service planning and also your housing planning. Okay, the census tells us that sometime in the 2040s, the majority of Americans will be minority. I'm a professor, right? I should understand these concepts. I don't get a majority-minority. It just doesn't, my brain doesn't process that. So a couple years ago, I thought, wait a minute. We are going towards a new majority. Now, the new majority is minorities all added up. But they're going to be the new majority, and so I've basically said that is, from my view, the new majority that we're facing. And I'm looking for an alternative term. I've spoken across the country using this term. Nobody's told me that the term is wrong or right, so I'm looking for maybe a better term. For the U.S. as a whole, practically all the growth between now and 2040 will be new majority growth. In fact, I do these presentations around the country. 9 times out of 10, when I make a presentation to a metropolitan area, that metropolitan area's growth will actually see fewer white non-Hispanics in 2040 than today, with all of the growth being the new majority growth. For Utah, it's about half the national rate. Still, look, the Utah base is very small, but we're going to grow from 500,000 people, new majority people, in 2010 to 1.2 million in 2040. Look at the growth rate. But look at Utah County. Utah and Wasatch County, Provo-Warren metropolitan area. You'll see the smallest rate of change or share of change attributable to the new majority between now and 2040, but you have a whopping increase in total population with the majority. So you're going to need to be prepared for that kind of diversity that's going to be happening. Okay, let's get down to some of the households by type. I divide the world up crudely in a few ways. One of those ways is number of and percent of household growth that will be households with children, single-person households, and in the middle, multiple adult person households without children. That's kind of a clumsy way to put it, but I don't know of any better way. So look at the U.S. as a whole. You have the numbers. I'm going to look at the percentages. Between 2010 and 2040 for the U.S. as a whole, only 19% of the net change in households will have children in them. I'm a baby boomer. In the 1950s, 40s, 50s, early 60s, more than half of American households had children in them. In 2040, about a quarter of American households will have children in them. And the share of growth of households will be just 19%. If you're in the home building business and you've been building McMansions, assuming the past is the future, get over it. Because the future is not building homes for families with children everywhere else in the country except here. You're a little different. You all know that. This is important. This is the only place I've been in the entire doing all these presentations where you're basically going to be seeing roughly comparable rates of growth in the future as in the past in terms of the demand for larger homes, for larger families, and so forth. So that is an anomaly here that I will still focus on because there are still some other challenges ahead of us. Now, something I also do is I look to the past and look to the future in terms of three very broad age groups. Households who I would call starter home households. These are people under 35 years of age. Households in their peak period of life where they need the space, 35 to 64. And then downsizing households, those who are, well, maybe not anymore, but those who used to have the children leave and then they would have the larger house and maybe not the need for such a large house. So let's look at the period between 1990 and 2010. I have given this kind of presentation, as I said, several dozens of times across the U.S. Your numbers are different, but when I show the numbers to Kansas City and to Nashville and to Cleveland and to everybody else, including Atlanta, Georgia, which is growing, mouths drop because elected officials normally think the future is the past. Gosh, we built all these single-family homes on larger lots between 1990 and 2010. We need to continue doing that. No. For most of the rest of the country, it's a very different world going forward. And even here, it's a little different going forward. But I'm going to also mention some things where it's more different than you might think. But let's look at the U.S. as a whole. Between 1990 and 2010, we actually saw a reduction in the number of starter home households. The boomers had grown up, and their children had not yet begun having their own children. Naturally, then, the market demand for apartment building shrank. Young households typically rent apartments. But look at the age group, the peak housing demand age group, 83% of the net change in total housing demand was driven by boomers coming into their own, making good money, having families, wanting the space, and being able to afford the space. What I don't show here is another figure. 80% of all new homes built in the U.S. between 1989 and 2009, a similar 20-year period, was single-family detached. We had the demand, we had the supply, we had a pretty good match. We did a good job. Now, my planning colleagues and architecture colleagues might bemoan the form of the job we did, but we met the demand. And look at the demand then for the downsizing households, about 20%. Fast forward to the nation, 2010 to 2040, we'll see a 17% change in the share of total demand among starter home households. We are therefore seeing an increase in demand for apartments and some smaller homes and smaller lots and townhouses and condos and so forth, because that is a growing group. That's the millennials coming into their own eventually. But look at the peak housing demand for the nation. It's going to be less than half of what it was earlier in the past 20 years. Less than 30% of the net share of demand nationally for peak housing households will be 29%. And more than half will be the downsizing households. Now, somebody mentioned, I forget, well, I think it was the speaker just before me, mentioned that a lot of people are becoming renters, a lot of, downsizing households. I made a presentation, some architecture group whose name escapes me now, Well-Heeled Architects. They took me to Naples, Florida, not the other one. And I spoke to them showing this stuff, and I got nodding heads. And I learned after my presentation that this particular group of architects, their sole niche right now is designing the upscale apartments for the downsizing 50-plus-year-olds who still work into their 70s. They want the high ceilings, they want the choice appointments in the kitchens, but they don't want the dining room. They want to have a dining facility someplace else in the complex. They want to be able to lock and leave. They want to feel safe in the facility. And they can't build these things fast enough as this age group is beginning to bail out of their homes, unlocking their equity, in some cases because they're afraid of losing any more equity, right? And getting out of their house and renting these facilities all across the country. It was an eye-opener for me. Utah is decidedly different from the U.S. as a whole, but we'll still see a small decrease in the peak housing demand. But the Provo-Orem metropolitan area will basically, your past is more or less your future in terms of the distribution of demand across the groups. Again, this is the first time I've seen this, but that doesn't mean you're out of the woods because there's a lot of other things going on that I'll begin to touch on. One of those things is declining home ownership rates. So this chart shows the home ownership rate for the U.S. between 1965, and that actually is the second quarter of 2015, kind of off the chart. I was able to do that this morning. We ramped up our home ownership rate so that in 2005, about 69% of American households owned their home, or they owned it with a bank, I guess. And we've been falling ever since. Now, right here, 2005, we were living in Alexandria, Virginia. I was teaching at Virginia Tech's Alexandria Center. I actually founded part of that center. In the mail to our cat one day came a letter from a bank inviting our cat, Valentine Nelson, to work with them to take out a loan that she's been pre-approved for a $500,000 mortgage at better terms than we had in our own home. She didn't have to demonstrate the ability to pay, didn't have to have a job. For some reason, she got this voucher in the mail. All she had to do was sign it, or paw print it, I guess, and send it back in for the real voucher to go to a realtor and a bank, the bank, to buy the home. Well, she didn't countersign the offer in 2005, and therefore the economy collapsed. So this is the trend for Utah, the red line, and U.S., blue line, between 1990 and 2015. You have a higher home ownership rate in Utah than most of the rest of the country, but you have a steeper decline since 2010 than the rest of the country. Something is going on here that I need to pay a little more attention to. As a matter of fact, almost all of your change in tenure, meaning owner and renter, between 2010 and today has been renter-driven in Utah. Almost all the demand. Now, in some metros, it's been more than all the demand. In some metros, I went to Bend, Oregon this summer, a very pretty area, a couple 100,000 people, 300,000 people. They have fewer homeowners this year than they had in 2005. I did a presentation, where was it? I forget where it was. But they have fewer they're growing. They have fewer homeowners in 2015 than in 2000. So there's something going on in the homeownership arena. And you need to be very careful about this. Robert.
They're the ones living in the basement.
Right. Well, that could be, yeah. Well, yeah. They are not counted as a tenure household unless they pay rent. So these are owners and renters. So what you're talking about is the multi-generational household, where otherwise a household qualifies as a household, but they pay no rent or own no property. No, they're counted as a multi-generational household, and that's another slide I should have put up here. Let me talk about that for a second, and I will go 3 hours. So in 1900, remember 1900, a quarter of American households were multi-generational households, 2 or more generations living in the same household. And we're not including the youth. These are people over 18. And that stayed the same to about 1940. By 1980, that had fallen to 12%, about half. But between 1980, despite recessions and booms and everything else, on a fairly steady uptick, we are now back to 16% of American households that are multi-generational in the U.S. I wouldn't be surprised if it's higher here in Utah or Provo. But we're headed to 2040 being back at the 20 to 24% ratio of multi-generational households. Now, nobody has factored this in, and we're trying to at Arizona now, and you should too. Your RCL people need to look at this. What will be the effect of an increasing share of multi-generational households on new housing demand? You can run those numbers. We need to get the consulting world, and maybe they're doing this. I don't think so either, and I pay attention to them. Nobody's better than they are, by the way. So a little story behind Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke and I have a lot of things in common. We have short hair on the top, we have a beard, we wear glasses. I don't see the glasses on right now. But something else going on. When he left the Federal Reserve Board, he couldn't get a loan. He was unemployed. How are you going to pay the loan off, Dr. Bernanke? Well, so I left the lovely University of Utah, which I miss dearly. It's a world-class university. Went to Arizona. My Utah employment was severed on May 15. We're closing May 20 in Tucson. And my new job in Tucson starts August 15. The academic year starts August 15. The bank says, uh-oh, Dr. Nelson, you're unemployed, aren't you? Well, until August, but you're not employed now, are you? I got a contract. That doesn't mean you'll execute the contract, right? We couldn't get a loan, despite having a 70% down payment on the house, 70% down payment on a house, an 800 credit score. I couldn't get a loan. So I can sympathize with Dr. Bernanke. The damn cat died. She couldn't get the loan, and so she just was heartbroken, I guess. So we pulled together all the money we had laying around, and then some, as you can imagine what that would be. So we paid the house free and clear. And now a year later, the banks are crawling to us, asking for the money. No, where were you when we needed you? If we have a difficult time getting a loan, what about our own children? And the 20% down payment, by the way, according to the American Housing Survey, only 16% of current American homeowners that have a mortgage put 20% or more down. 84% of American households that have a mortgage put less than 20% down. That's history. And I've heard stories from my own, I keep track of my graduate students. They get, they leave school, they get married, have families, they try to buy homes. A third of them can't buy a home because of the screwball underwriting requirements. And that's a whole other lecture I can get into. So what is the change in tenure then for the U.S., Utah, Provo, Orem, and Salt Lake? My best guess is that renters will account for about half of the net change in demand for housing between 2010 and 2040 in the U.S. And you're not too far behind. 40% of your net change in demand in this metropolitan area will be for renters between 2010 and 2040. And that also means, I guess, that 40%, are bad people. If by definition a renter is a bad person, that means 40% of our net change of demand are bad people. I do this sometimes. I'll do it here, I guess. How many people in this room have ever rented any house or any apartment? Okay, well then by definition you're all bad people. Salt Lake will be 60%. Clark Ivory, a good friend of mine who's a home builder, saw these numbers, and we've been talking over the years, and he ran an independent check on my projections and realized I was right. He had Harvard University to do a double check on me, and I passed the Harvard University test. They didn't pass my test, by the way. So Clark Ivory, about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, announced, and it was in the papers, that half of his future production for his company will be rental housing. I was floored that he would make that switch that quickly. But he saw the numbers, and he's a very smart businessman. That's why he survives. So, yeah.
Just define renter for
a person who pays money to rent their living abode.
So an adult moving to an assisted living center.
They're moving into a group home. That is different. Thanks for the clarification. Assisted living, nursing home, memory care, student housing and dorms, those are all considered group homes, and they're not in my calculation.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. No, thank you. I should be more careful. Okay. Robert touched on this earlier with his Envision Utah surveys. This is a national survey done by the National Association of Realtors. By the way, I'm a planner, though I hardly ever took a planning course in college, but I have become a planning professor. I do not trust any poll generated by my profession. It's going to be biased, and I hate to say it. I love my colleagues. But the National Association of Realtors, I asked one of the vice presidents, I said, you're doing these surveys, and they're almost, sometimes they're a little nerve-wracking to the industry, right? He says, oh no. My realtors need to know where the market is going so they know what to sell and how to sell it best. So they need to know. Well, one thing about the survey, I love the survey because they start off with one very nice question. The first question they ask, one of the first questions is, right now today, what kind of a home would you like to live in? And they give you, 10 choices. A single-family detached home, apartment, townhouse, condominium, a single wide next to a toxic waste dump, those choices. Well, 80%, surprise, surprise, say single-family detached home. And so the press picks up on that. Of course, we all want something many of us will never get. I would like to be filthy rich. Well, I can't. Not unlikely anyway. I'd like to live 120 years. It's unlikely. But the survey that the NAR does, then it says, okay, now that we know what you want, let's figure out what you can get and what your trade-offs are. Those are called forced choice questions. And they tease out from people looking at stark choices between stark circumstances where they would make their ultimate decision. And people are smart. We process all kinds of information. So one of the things is, imagine for a moment that you're moving to another community. These questions are about the kind of community you want to live in. Would you want to own or rent an apartment or townhouse and have an easy walk to shops and restaurants and have a shorter commute to work? That's one of the many choices. 40% of all households said yes. Now, 60% said no. Right? 60% said no. But 40% said yes. And guess how many people right now today in the U.S. have this mix? It's about 10%. Now, we've done the 60% very well. We've delivered on the larger home, on the larger lot, far away from everything else, with a long drive to work. We've done that. We've done that so much that now there's more of that than the market demands all across the country. Maybe not here, but maybe here a little bit. But certainly in Atlanta, Tucson, Phoenix, Dallas, Minneapolis, Nashville, I've been to all those places, and I've seen it firsthand. We've done that more than the market demands. In order for us to deliver what the 40% of the market wants, we'd have to build all new housing with these opportunities between now and 2050, and we still wouldn't hit the 40%. We're that far behind. So when you're going around this community, I don't know Provo that well anymore, it's been already a couple of years, but my sense is that the homes that are holding their value, if not increasing in value, are in these kinds of communities. I do know for a fact that when you have rental units, townhouses, condos, apartments, in these kinds of communities, they command top rent. And their rent, by the way, is escalating at double digits sometimes in certain metropolitan markets. Now, households with children, it's about a third that want that. Now, 2/3 don't, but 35% do. That's a big number. 35% of 50 million households is a big number. 2+ person households without children, that's about 40%. Look at the people living alone. About half of the people living alone, most of them empty nesting boomers like me. I'm not single, thankfully. Half of the people living alone want this opportunity. This is where the market is heading nationally, and part of this market is right here today. But I also sense that you're probably a little ahead of the curve with what I've seen driving through Provo already. Which leads me to a missing market in most markets. I don't know about the Utah County or Salt Lake County markets that much anymore, but it's what we call the middle housing market. This is the housing that's not the detached or not the high-rise attached. These are duplexes, fourplexes, bungalow courthouses, townhouses, live-work units. These are the easily infill site homes that what we are seeing around Salt Lake County pretty pervasively. This is where the 40% market is. These infill locations, as you already have in Provo and Orem, these infill locations do provide these kinds of opportunities more often than not. And these are half-acre, 1-acre sites, or maybe there's an old home on it that's going to burn down anyway. You might as well take it off and put this kind of housing into it. This kind of housing can be built on existing parking lots, along existing arterials and some collectors, and so forth. This could very well be our driving market for the future. Okay, let's focus a bit on job growth. I'm gauging my time here. I'm going to bomb through, well, I'll just see. So jobs, you're going to be adding jobs. Big surprise. A lot of jobs. You'll be doubling your jobs basically between 2010 and 2040. But let's look at where those jobs go and where maybe some of the middle housing opportunities go. This is a dead or dying strip center, what I call the new promised land. Now, do you have any of these here in Provo or none, right? No, none. You do? One? Multiple, okay. Well, these are wonderful opportunities for achieving the next wave of market demand. They are fairly large tracts of land. They're flat. Maybe they didn't used to be, but they're flat now. Probably pretty well drained. They're under one set of ownerships that has one thing in common, that's to make money. Uh, they're on streets that are 4-lane, 6-lane, 8-lane, 12-lane streets. And so these are transit-ready corridors. And you can rip up the infrastructure if you need to in those rights-of-way and put in the higher grade new ones needed. All of the ingredients are here in place to make this work for the next wave of development. And by the way, back here is a neighborhood that is fit to be tied to have a dead or dying strip center in their backyard. The trick would be to bring them to the table and move them from being NIMBYs, not in my backyard, to YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, fix this. So there's a growing movement in planning, urban design, architecture, and even among developers to bring the neighbors to the table and have them become stakeholders in the design and execution of these redevelopment sites. As a matter of fact, the planning director in Nashville, Tennessee says to a developer, anytime a developer comes to his office and developer says, I want a zone change to put in something very nice, Rick Bernhardt says, you bring the neighbors in with you next time, and it's a joint application. And it works. It scares the developers, but developers, when they do this, it works. Now, if you added up all of the privately owned parking lots in this country, not residential parking lots, not streets, just the commercial strip, warehouse, industrial, office, retail parking lots in this country, add them all up. The total land area of all those parking lots would exceed the land area of New Jersey, which is often called the Garden State. This is where the opportunities are across America to meet the next wave of new job demand and new housing demand, because what Robert told us earlier, there's a growing demand for mixed land uses on the same site, the retail, the office, and the residential. So this is the slide that Robert was hoping I would be presenting, and I added it back in. This slide shows the lifespan of buildings. Now, the far right-hand side, the average life of a home built after 1940, believe it or not, based on demolition rates, is 170 years. So I tell my planning colleagues, whenever you approve a residential development, you take that site off your planning maps for anything else but residential forever. Maybe not forever, but 100 years to 200 years. That's kind of forever in planning cycles. Now, this number came up through 3 different data sets. So I think the number is pretty solid. I had a good friend at Southern California who didn't like that I included manufactured homes in my database. Well, yeah, I included all homes. He took manufactured homes out, and he said, well, the real number is 250 years. Okay, that's a long time. Then there's a fellow out at MIT or Harvard or someplace like that who fails my straight face test. He says the average home will last 500 years, meaning that any home built shortly after Columbus arrived still stands today. Well, whatever the number is, it's a long time. And because it's a long time, people hang on to their homes. Their homes are their vessels to the communities. So when you approve and develop something residential, you take them off the list forever for redevelopment. And oh, by the way, you've also built in automatic NIMBYs in the area, because they're going to do whatever they can, for all the good reasons, frankly, to protect their interest in their home, right? But look at these guys over here. The non-residential space in this country averages about 40 years useful life. Some will be a couple hundred years, the skyscrapers, some 10, 15 years, the old cheap retail strips, but on average about 40 years. Which means that since we have 100 billion square feet of non-residential space in this country, 40 years from now, 40 billion square feet of that will be replaced. These are big numbers. Now, furthermore, consider that the average floor area ratio of these spaces is 0.25, which means that on a 40,000 square foot piece of land, roughly 1 acre, 10,000 square feet of that land is devoted to the building space, or the building is 10,000 square feet of the land. The rest of that land, 75%, 30,000 square feet, is parking area. So 40 billion square feet of non-residential space being replaced is equivalent to 160 billion square feet of land. How many acres is that? I used to have that number. I can't, my brain is toast. Somebody here calculated. Yeah, we got somebody calculating this. Acres and then convert to square miles. It's going to be an interesting number. Okay, so why is it that the non-residential spaces deteriorate so quickly? For one thing, they're not built to last very long. And why should they? They're built to last as long as the investor can justify making the investment to make the money on the property. It's a commodity. And get over it. That's what it is. So let's trace through some of the interesting nuances of these properties, however. Suppose we open a building up tomorrow morning, and it's a 50-year useful life building. I'm using Marshall Swift schedules. And suppose that building is 80% of the total property value tomorrow morning, with 20% of the property value being the land. That's roughly the relationship. Do you have the number? I thought you calculated the number. It was too big for it busted the machine. So, and that building space erodes or depreciates at 2% per year, straight line 50 years. So here's the depreciation line for the building, but the land increases in value as the population of the metropolitan area increases. And your population is increasing at about 3 or 4% per year compounded. I'm using a Salt Lake County rate here of 2% per year compounded. So we see that if at some point in time, the land is worth more than the building. And when that happens, the building owner says, whoops, I need to move this building to the next highest and best use to generate more revenue from my investment. That's what they're after. So at some point before, and certainly some point after, a decision is made to replace the building, knock it down, rebuild something else, or reconfigure the building. Something happens to that building to get more money from that product. So we did this exercise when I was at the University of Utah through my Metropolitan Research Center, and we did this for Salt Lake County. This is south of Sandy area. We color-coded. The darker the color, the more imminent the property could be redeveloped. We only looked at non-residential property. We did not want to show a homeowner here that they were doomed. The last thing you want to do to a voter and their home is to tell them they're doomed. I learned that a long time ago in my old planning days. Nor should they even be doomed. They need to be at the table helping us make these hard decisions. So we look at the non-residential properties, and the lighter colors are redevelopable by 2040 thereabouts. But for planning purposes, let's say, gee, we have all these properties right here. They're all about 2030. They all come due for redevelopment. What if we did something novel? What if we got everybody together? What if we got the property owners, maybe the tenants together, and the residential areas together, and we said, boys and girls, in 2030, this area is toast. Rather than go through a series of rezonings, bloody, ugly rezonings, one at a time, beginning in 2025 to 2040, why don't we sit down today and map out what would work for your neighborhood and for the property owners and for the economy of the city? And this is what Rick Bernhardt does in Nashville, Tennessee. He doesn't do it this scientific, but he does it intuitively. But we can do this thing here in Utah County. We can take your data and do your mapping, and you can see what properties are doomed now, what properties are doomed in 30, 40 years, and then begin to do your long-range planning accordingly. So for Provo, Orem metropolitan area, I estimated that in 2010 you had about 100 million square feet of non-residential space, give or take. You're going to have to add another 100 million square feet of occupied space by 2040 to account for new workers. But you're going to tear down and replace 200 million square feet. Sometimes the same building will be, or the same site will have a building built, torn down, and built again, and torn down again, because the building itself might not last very long. So you add up all the numbers, and you'll be seeing about 300 million square feet of non-residential development between 2010 and 2040. And that's roughly 3 times more space than existed in 2010. And by the way, that's about a $30 billion figure there, using inexpensive construction. So the challenges are you have a limited land supply, rising infrastructure costs all across the country. We have stagnating incomes. The paper today was not very optimistic on that again. How do we unlock the potential that these non-residential opportunities have? A question somewhere? Yeah. Next slideshow, please.
So some of our buildings are built with these 30-year lives. And looking at that graph, it makes a lot of sense now. But at the same time, right now, our community is celebrating the remodeling, the restoration of a historic building that really is a landmark, and it's just, our community loves that building. And sometimes I look back, and we have a handful of these beautiful buildings, but not many of them have come to pass in the last 50, 60 years. And I almost think it's this disposable mentality. And so where are those buildings that people don't look and say, hey, in 30 years, the land's going to be more valuable than the building, so I'm just going to make it out of cardboard, which a lot of the construction is now. Where's the balance there? Or is there a balance? Does it depend on place?
Good point, because in our mapping, I told my mappers to take every historically significant property and take it off the table. So what you're seeing are the privately owned, non-historically significant properties. So that's what we would do. We would not even have those properties on the table for consideration, or even residential properties. And by the way, there's enough non-residential land area along the corridors in vast amounts of parking lots in Salt Lake County to more than accommodate all their future job and residential growth to the year 2040 and beyond. So that was why we did the exercise. But I'll be the first to say that we need to do a lot more nuanced thinking about how to use the information. I would love to have planners and landowners get together and see the information. That's what we built the database for that. And it's not being done. It drives me nuts. It's there. It's there to tell you which site is going to become rebuildable, by what year. It's unfortunate, and I don't know why. So the second part of this presentation, I'm going to probably have to go quickly through some of the technical slides. It's public tools to leverage private investment. And I may go a little after 12, not much after 12, since I did get a little late start. Hello. There we go. I'll talk briefly about the development cycle. You'll kind of all know that intuitively. How we do real estate investment analysis, focusing on whether a project is financially feasible, tools to achieve financial feasibility, application to an example, and then my decision rules, and I'll bomb through a few of these. Except, I stumbled across this a couple days ago. This is some fellow's dissertation graphic. So, beginning back in the 1990s, early 2000s, and he traced all this. So here's the real estate market mentality. And I know a lot of real estate developers, and they're really interesting people, but talk about manic depressive. You know, they have no fear, for one thing. They have no fear. And everything is optimistic, and then at some point in time, everything is pessimistic. It's, it's manic depressive. So here's the market. We see the smart money finding the good investments to make, and then other people begin to follow the smart money, and then suddenly everybody says, oh, we got to get on the bandwagon. This was the 2000s, right? 2002 to 2006 or 7 or so. We have greed and enthusiasm, and some new paradigm is coming out of the, I saw this. Then we hit 2005 and 69%, and 2006 and 7 and 8, the ownership rates are coming down, and so we have denial. There's a new normal coming. Just brace yourselves. I heard this. And then, 2009, 2010, we have fear, capitulation, and then despair hit about 2011 in many areas I work in. Didn't happen that way here as much, but it sure happened around the country, kind of following this curve. So this is the cycle of development. You can imagine that we start off with the value of land, we build a building, and then the building wears out, and the land gets more valuable, and so on and so forth. It's basically what I showed you earlier, but over maybe 100 years of time. Okay, take out your laptops and follow through the next 2 hours as I discuss all these numbers. This is a very simplified pro forma that shows the land cost, preparation cost, the building cost, hard cost, soft cost, total project cost. Let's say this is a 100,000 square foot building. This might, this is actually one building. These are all attached buildings. So 100,000 square feet in the building, it might cost us about $13 million to build if the land is a good price. That's a good deal. That's a good deal. Rent per square foot, $1.25 a month. Maybe this is a rental property for apartments. That's probably a little on the high side for this market. I don't know for sure, but that's pushing the market, certainly in Salt Lake City. An average rent per square foot. Then you have your gross income, miscellaneous income, deductions for vacancy, the operating costs, taxes, and so your NOI, the net operating income, becomes the one number that people use, like me, to estimate the value of the property. And we estimate the value of the property by looking at the capitalization rate, which is it's a reflection of the relative risk to buy real estate and hold it. The higher the capitalization rate, the lower the value of the building, because you need to get more return out of the building, so you have to pay less for the building. Alternatively, the lower the capitalization rate, the less risky the building is, the more you pay for the building. A 6.25 is roughly your market capitalization rate now, I think, for sort of middle-of-the-road apartments. And I could be wrong on that, but I looked this up a couple of weeks ago, which means that the market value for the project is $11,500,000. The value is less than the cost. Would anybody in their right mind make this investment? Of course not. I don't know any developer who's in business now who makes investments to lose money. Okay, but what if this is something we want in our community? How can we make this work? What do we have to do to offset this loss to the developer so our development that we want to see actually occurs? This comes to an area called value capture. To what extent does this building generate other values to the community that we can capture and then use to offset the losses? And to what extent will the building itself generate other values to the community that are important to us that we can also capture? So, for example, if this is a retail site and the person is losing $1 million, this building still generates sales tax revenues back to the community that aren't part of this calculation. So maybe the retail generation would be sufficient enough to justify supporting the building. So these are the components of value capture. Again, I have the slides available for you, but basically, value capture accrues to the developer. The developer needs to take advantage of some of the value he or she creates. The community needs to recoup value created to pay the costs of infrastructure and so forth. but there's this other value that the community can capture to leverage other new development. And this is what we're talking about here. This might be the top part of the value capture that we can bring back to the community to create a pool of revenues to then make it possible to get these kinds of developments in our community. So what are the tools? Interestingly enough, one tool is your zoning itself. I have heard case study after case study where a community desperately wanted this townhouse development or whatever it was, but the zoning code just didn't allow for it. Well, change the zoning. And in many cases, all you had to do was change the zoning and the market responded by building the product you wanted. Not all the time, certainly, but in a surprisingly large numbers of situations. Streamlined plan checking. Time is money, as one speaker said earlier today. The city of Salt Lake City under Mayor Becker reduced its plan check time for complex projects from 6 months to 3 weeks. And under his leadership, Salt Lake City had a lot of development. Okay, so when we start to use our public tools, and I'll talk about those very briefly, what do we want to achieve out of these tools? We want to leverage private investment, but not everywhere. We want private investment leveraged in certain parts of the community. You've probably already done that in your mapping. You want this area redeveloped and that area redeveloped. Other parts of the city are just fine. You want to regenerate the local economy, stimulate private investment in other properties nearby, accelerate development and redevelopment, absorb excess capacity in facilities. I added this to the list because about 2 years ago somebody said, well, they wanted more development downtown because they're not using half the water that's allocated to downtown, and rather than build new water lines out to the suburbs, let's have development absorb the capacity already existing downtown. Wow, good point. And generate new taxes and revenues and so forth. So there are several areas of what I call direct financial tools: abatements, land and building write-downs, fee waivers, tax increment financing. So I'll touch on those briefly. Property tax abatement. Now, this can be complex because you have a lot of different people taxing property, the hospitals and the pets people and the schools, of course, and the local government, and a lot of people have their hand in the property tax till. To the extent you can get a lot of them lined up to agree to abatement, this single technique has been proven time and again to be, to use a Trump term, massively effective. And it doesn't cost you anything. These abatements run 2, 5, 10, maybe 20 years at various percentages. All it is not collecting money for some period of time from the new development occurring on the site. And then that abatement goes off, and then you get all that money coming in. I've had developers tell me personally that the single most important trigger that stimulates them to build in the Phoenix area, the Tucson area where I live now, is the property tax abatement. And it's a 7-year window in Tucson. After 7 years, everything comes back to the city. And the cities, by the way, the city of Tucson has leveraged $500 million in private investment in downtown through this one technique. Yeah.
I've heard of cases where that sort of thing's been done, tax abatement, whether it's property or some other thing. But then I've heard that it's for a certain amount of time, and then the business leaves at that point. And I'm wondering, is there a model where it's nothing to begin and then it just ramps up slowly, where it encourages them to stay, but it's not a shocker when it kicks in?
These things can be all over the ballpark. Atlanta, Georgia did something I thought was very, addressed this very carefully and wisely. They had 100% abatement the first year, 90% the second, 80, 70. So within 10 years, you were scaled off the abatement. And the property owners loved it, yeah. They could plan for it, and it wasn't a big shock. So yeah, I can see where you can have every case is different, of course, but more often than not, abatement, I think, works. I'm going to skip over that. Land write-downs, maybe you have land you already own in the community, maybe you can leverage that land. By the way, a lot of communities are picking up property through property tax foreclosures, or they get property for some reason. Raise your hand, repeat after me. I will never, ever give property away. Of course, you never say never, ever, but publicly owned property that can be leveraged into private investment ought to nonetheless be held by the public. Do a land lease. It can be a cheap land lease, because your benefit is getting the building built and the people occupying the building and sales taxes going and people maybe moving into the community because they can work in that building. You get a lot of other collateral benefit. And make it a cheap land lease. But that's your long-term endowment. In 100 years, when you have a lot of these properties all around the city and they're all coming up for renewal, you can adjust the next generation land leases. Whole families do these all around the world. Downtown London, England is owned by a family, and they land lease the property out. So think for the long term when you actually own your own property. I'm going to skip over this right now. Building write-downs and grants. I'm going to skip over these. I'm going to get to a couple. Okay, fee waivers. Another area where my developer clients say really big changes in their attitudes occur is when fees can be reduced or waived. Now, there's a lot of talk about impact fees, and I actually happen to have written a couple of books on impact fees, and I'm surprised that so many people do them wrong. That's why I'm in court all the time, it seems, but that's another story. If you have pretty high impact fees, I don't know what your impact fees are here, but if you have high impact fees, that could dissuade developers from coming in. One way as an economic development tool to sweeten a new development is to say to the developer, this is your impact fee for this site. We will use other funds, economic development funds, to pay those fees on your behalf. Oh, and then you tell them, and in exchange for those impact fees, you're getting the roads and the water and the sewer you need for your development. That's what the impact fees pay for. The developers in Florida really like that kind of generosity by local governments. The fee is still paid, but it's not paid by them, and they know how much the fee was paid by somebody else, and they can physically see what the fees were paid for with the roads and water and sewer that they're using. But other kinds of fees could be waived or reduced depending on your local policies. Okay, tax increment financing, we do a lot of that in Utah, I think pretty well. I think most states do tax increment financing pretty well. But you have to do a plan. These are the TIF steps, but you have to do a plan. This is the plan for Salt Lake City. They've designated certain areas downtown, near downtown. I think that goes out to the airport, North Temple. So the city says, here is where we will try to use public resources to leverage investment, TIF being one of the many resources. Tax abatement is another one of those. Fee waivers is another one of those, and so on for Salt Lake City. So here's how tax increment financing works. For one thing, you have to get all of the property tax entities to agree to this plan. And sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes there's a holdout. But more often than not, everybody sees their own long-term interest bettered by this process. So the current taxes assessed on a property are frozen. I pay $1,000 a year on my little piece of land, and I will pay $1,000 a year every year thereafter for, let's say, a 20-year TIF period. And that $1,000 goes to the county tax assessor. Then the city or county or somebody borrows money by selling bonds to put in the better water, sewer, roads, maybe build a park, do other things to make the area attractive. And those bonds are then paid off by the new property taxes that new development generates. So if I develop my property and I raise its value from whatever, $100,000 to $1 million, the value gained is $900,000, and the tax rate is, say, 1%. So my $9,000 additional tax bill is then set off to pay for the bonds used to build the roads and water and sewer and parks that made my development exciting to me. And then at some point in time, the bond is paid off, and all of that money flows to all of the participating taxing jurisdictions. And it's a huge windfall when it occurs. Portland and Seattle and Boston and Kansas City and other cities have used this for so long now that they can predict, you know, in 2025, here will be the brand new tax revenues coming back to these cities from these projects. And so the cities begin programming well in advance this tax revenue because they have such a history and it's so predictable to them that they trust it. Certainly within tolerance levels. We always have our pluses or minuses. There are some downsides of TIF. It does erode into your bonding base. Every state has a formula that tells local governments how much, what percent of their taxable value can be bonded against. So it does push you up to that bond cap. You need the cooperation of all the taxing agencies. That can be a trick. They are expensive. Had I known how wealthy bond attorneys are when I began my career 40 years ago, I would have been a bond attorney. Now I'm just a lowly professor. I love my job, though. And then there is the risk that if new development doesn't happen, the local taxpayers have to cough up the money. That hasn't happened very often. To their credit, state laws setting up TIF processes are pretty good. And by that I mean to say they are so nervous about protecting taxpayers that they probably go overboard in doing so, so that only the best projects, or usually the best projects, get in. But there's other alternatives. You can do a TIF approach without bonding. Well, this top one says you can use sales taxes instead of property taxes to pay the bond off. But look at this, down here at the bottom. A lot of communities I've worked with around the country, they have small area redevelopment plans. They want to vacate a road, build a new road, put a water sewer in, but they haven't got the money and they don't want to go through the TIF bonding process. And so they don't. But that developer who comes in, who wants to build on that site, the city says, okay, we will take, if you build, we will take all of your property taxes that you pay us anyway, but we'll use it to build that road directly benefiting your property, or putting in the new sewer line or the new water line, or whatever's needed. Salt Lake City does this a lot. So it's pay-as-you-go tax increment financing. You pay the bills from the increment of taxes generated, and that money helps build the very facilities that you use to facilitate development on the property anyway. These are small scale, you know, parcel by parcel, maybe block by block, but they are very effective. Public loans. So a lot of local redevelopment agencies, especially in Utah, offer low interest second or third or fourth position loans to facilitate private investment. I think Salt Lake City charges 3 or maybe 4% these days for a 5 or 10 year loan, and it's they're subordinate to the bank, or maybe subordinate to a bank and another financier. So they're taking a very low position for the loan. They do their due diligence, of course, and I'm not sure they've ever failed in one of these. Maybe they have, but I haven't heard of one failing. And they charge 3 or 4%. So this alone, the low interest loan alone, is enough oftentimes to leverage the private sector, because equity is very near and dear to the investor. That's the money out of their own pocket. The best investment for them is where somebody else pays all the bills, and all they do is get all the profits, right? Well, we want them to have a skin in the game, but they need to get their reward, otherwise they're not going to pay, or play or pay. And that reward these days is about 15 to 20% of the total project cost per year on their equity. If they put $1 million in, they need to make a couple $100,000 a year back from the property every year to justify their risk and the time and effort required. That's just how it works. I'm sorry, boys and girls. But if we can reduce their $1 million to $500,000, they still make their 20%. By giving them a 3 or 4% loan, then they're more at ease making the investment, and the project doesn't have to generate as much revenue to justify the total investment as otherwise needed. And so we get more development that way. 2 questions, 3 questions.
If the life is only 30 years, we start the process over again, and the communities really don't get the benefits in it sometimes. That's what's scary.
I'll get to that. Yeah, good question. I thought I saw another hand. What you get in return is you do get the property tax revenues, you do get the sales tax revenues, you do get oftentimes collateral development around the area that would not have occurred otherwise. The people working in the building may buy a home in your community that might not otherwise be bought, and they might spend more money in the community because they work in the community. So it's a lot of different little things that do add up over time. And if your cost is only 3 or 4% in the public sector, you could be getting many times more than that back through these other drips and drabs of new revenues. Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of banks actually they're very skittish about, loaning, for example, an apartment complexes where the developer ends up having to go after, moderate income housing financing, and that's how most of, the apartments are being financed around here in Provo. How do you get the banks to broaden their horizons to build a more successful project?
I don't know. I do not represent the banks. I fight with them, as you heard earlier today. My suspicion, though, is that if the bank knows the city of Provo is coming in with $1 million second at 4%, the bank might think, well, okay, if they're putting their money in a subordinate position and we're first, that might create a little more confidence with the bank. I don't know, but it might. Again, I don't know. Now, one other thing that a group of us are suggesting, of course, when you have a low-interest loan, you're getting money back from the loan through interest. But suppose you put up a property tax abatement, and it might cost you $1 million over 10 years. Now, you're getting a lot of that money back in other ways, but maybe rather than giving the money away, you work with the developer so that you convert that $1 million tax abatement into an equity position in the investment that might pay out on the refinancing of the project or when the project sells. Could be 10, 15, 20 years. You don't care about the time. But when the property does sell, you get your money back and maybe a piece of the action. This is a new idea brewing around the country, and so I'm just laying it out for you to think about. And that's the gist of that slide there. So I have rules. This is my last slide, second to last slide. I have rules on how you do these things. This book that I just gave you is a product of, I've written 25 books. Some books take me a few months to write. That book took me 30 years to write because it's based on a course that I've taught all around the country that shows planning students, architecture students, and business students how to understand real estate finance and how to figure out the minimum amount of money the local government needs to spend to leverage the private sector, and no more, What is that dollar amount? So that's the first part. Provide what is needed, but no more. We all have stories about cities unwittingly, trying to do the right thing, but unwittingly giving a lot more out than they should have. Provide the mix of public financing tools that minimizes the loss to the city. Tax abatement is easy. TIF might be a little more on the risky side. So find the mix of tools that you have the most comfort in minimizing the risk that you're not getting that money back. Maximize the private investment. The least amount of money put up to maximize the most amount of private investment. Take the long view. It might cost you something this year, next year, and the rest of this decade, but you might be gaining a whole lot of money or branding or collateral development the rest of the century. So do some things now that might be a little painful, taking prudent risks, because you're in it for the long term. And then where you can, convert your money into a position in the project itself. It doesn't have to be a 15% annualized return position, but maybe a 3 or 4 or 5% annualized return position. After all, you don't pay taxes, the developer does. That's why the developer's return has to be 15, 20%, because they pay 40% taxes. And with that, thank you all very much. Now, when I was in Salt Lake City, we lived above the Capitol building, and one day we learned that Jupiter was as close to Earth as it had been since the 1960s. So I took my handheld camera out, not even a tripod, and I shot Jupiter 100 times and got 2 clean slides. This is one of them. I caught Jupiter and its 4 moons. Then when I put this on my computer, I wondered, what is that there? That's Uranus. I got Jupiter and the 4 moons and Uranus on the same shot, so I show it off. Thank you.